Footprints, in the wet grass, told the story before anyone spoke. They threaded from the low ridge like a feverish sentence, pressed shallow and hurried where the prairie sod gave, and ended at the little cabin door where a single boot had scuffed. A pause, and then 3 smaller, surer prints that moved together like a promise. He noticed them, because he noticed everything that touched his land. The cowboy had learned to read the world in small signs: a bent blade of grass, a scrape on the fence post, the way the wind came hard from the west before a storm. These were the sentences from which he patched a life. He lived by that language. He had built the cabin with hands that could still make a door fit, and a hearth that kept the house warm through winters, when frost crept even into his boots. He kept a kettle always ready, a pot always clean, a stack of blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. The prairie was a record keeper. The cabin was the place where those records were consulted. Above him, the sky had been a single sheet of pale gray. Now, rain began like a soft finger, tapping the tin roof, then harder, as if impatience had learned to drum. The first drops were neat and polite. The second wave came with wind. It came quick, the storm, a dark thing unrolling itself from some far place, where the horizon kept its secrets. The cowboy stood by the door and watched the gate of the clouds. His hand found the latch as if by habit. He did not have company to consider. Thunder had never been a matter of conversation here. He had built his life to be small. A roof over his head, a stretch of prairie to wander, a horse that knew the bounds of a man's loneliness, and returned to its post each night. Then the knocking began. Not the orderly beat of a visitor, but a frantic, wet rap, small fist on wood. He opened the door to rain, to a land scent of wet leather and smoke. 2-3 figures, leaning into the threshold like reeds, bent by the same wind. They were tall where they needed to be, and compact in the way of those who owned their bodies for purpose. Their hair was braided and plain, their clothes patched in places that told of hard miles. One woman walked ahead with the steadier step, her eyes taking in the light and the angle of the roof with a grazing soldier's caution. She was the one who spoke first, in a careful English that had learned mercy before words. "Roof," she said, pressing her hands together. Her sentence was a single piece of wood moved across a river. The cowboy hesitated. The prairie had taught him prudence. Strangers were not always trouble, but trouble was often the reason for strangers looking for shelter. He could have shut the door and left the storm to take their fate. He could have told himself that a man survives by keeping his hearth for himself. Instead, he stepped back and felt the heat of the cabin as an argument. It was not a heroic choice so much as a small assent. A man who had spent his days mending fences and setting bones knew what it meant to be needed. "Come in," he said. The invitation was a close thing, spoken low, a sound to guard them from the wind. They entered with the rain in their hair. The second woman moved with a coiled silence, eyes like a path cleared of shrub. The third watched everything at once, the way a person watches the change in a horse's shoulder. They shut the door behind them. The sound of the latch was a finality. The cabin took them inside, and the prairie let the rain fall without explaining itself. Inside the small house, the light was a soft thing. The fire threw gold on the ceiling beams, and turned the wet into steam that rose and braided with the smoke. He had an old kettle that sang a little when it reached simmer. He fed it with wood he had stacked himself, splitting and carrying it, because it made time taste whole. He set a pot out and began to scrape a piece of salted meat he kept for emergencies. He always kept stew bones for a day like this, because hunger often moved faster than hunger for companionship, and because when the land was rough, you learned to be ready for those who came thirsty. They sat with their coats open to the fire, letting warmth find them as if it had been misplaced. The first woman unwrapped a cloth around her shoulders and pressed it tighter. The cloth was patched in a way that pleased him. Careful stitches, not thrown with anger. The second woman seated herself like a sentinel, her hands resting on her knees as if those hands were a promise to herself. The third woman watched the cowboy tie the rope for the kettle over the hearth. studied the way his fingers had calluses and knuckles that had known cold and rope alike. Language was spare. They ate from wooden bowls, and passed them between themselves, with a compact etiquette that made every motion a sentence. The first woman said, "Thank you," in English that had learned its place in the world. The cowboy only nodded, ladling soup that smelled of onion and meat and dill he had taken to growing in a tiny bed near the door, because it made the cabin smell like someone else's kitchen, which in truth was what he wanted sometimes. They chewed quietly, like people who had learned a lot between words, between bites and the soft crack of the fire. He watched them. He watched how the second woman handled the blankets she had been given. Not as if it were charity, but as if she was testing it for utility, smoothing a fold the way someone might test a rope for strength. He watched the third woman's eyes as they slid around the cabin and settled on a small shelf, holding a folded piece of paper, a rock that had once been smoothened by river, and a faded scrap of cloth he used to rub his hands free of tar. The women exchanged looks over the bowl. There was communication there, without contact, a language built from spared syllables and nods. When the rain led up to a steady whisper, the first woman stepped forward and touched the kettle with a cautious finger, as if testing for warmth that was not too hot. "Warm," she said. The word arrived like a gift. The cowboy found himself telling her how he would feed the fire, how the stove took a certain kind of wood to keep a steady heat. He kept his sentences plain. He had no need to gild any part of a life that had been stripped to essentials. They slept near the hearth on blankets he had taken from a trunk he rarely opened. He had kept those blankets because one week their scent brought someone to mind, and another they brought comfort to a calf in frost. The women did not lie together, as if for warmth only. They occupied the space, as if each had reserved a stretch of it, by right. The cowboy made sure the door was latched, sliding the iron bar across the inside. He left the lantern lit, low and steady, and sat in his chair with his hands where he could find them. He had time, in the hush that followed, to consider his small inventory of compassion. A bowl, a blanket, a light. Those were things that could be given without losing oneself entirely. He thought of the long list of letters he never sent, folded pages, kept in a leather pocket, meant for a hand that would never take them. Sometimes he imagined writing one, not to any specific person, but to the prairie itself, telling it everything a man had learned from wind and frost. The idea felt both silly and necessary. It was a private religion, of small objects, and quiet rituals. Outside, the prairie kept its own vigil. Rain flattened the grass into rippling waves that moved like a crowd, whispering. The land remembered the pass of horses and the drag of carts, the place where a child had once run a fever and the night when the northern lights had drawn in ribbons of green. Memory here was not the fever of the human mind but the slow, patient ledger of the earth. Tracks, pressed and held in mud, a hollow where water pooled each year, a stump that the wind had nibbled into a particular shape. The prairie held what it had seen in the way a keeper holds records, not sentimental, but sure. By morning the sky had cleared to a thin blue, and the cabin smelled of stew remainders, and the dry wood that had been fed to the fire. He woke to find the women, already awake, sitting not far from the hearth. The first woman had unfolded herself, and was smoothing the blanket with the back of her hand. The second woman had rolled the edge of the fabric between forefinger and thumb in a movement almost like counting. The third watched the window where early light found the pattern of dust on the glass. They did not ask for more than he could give. They were strangers who had borne rain, and found a door where they could put their bodies down for a while. He brought out a loaf, still dense, from the dutiful kneading he did on some mornings. The first woman took a small piece, and chewed it like a person testing bread for a secret. It was warm, and ordinary, and honest. She smiled. A quick flare, of something private. The cowboy felt that smile, like a small sun, warming a place he had thought long emptied. He had enough questions, for a life that had been spent among few voices, but he kept them careful. He asked where they had been traveling. The first woman named a place with a word the cowboy did not know. The sentence was shaded with a location as precise as a hand-drawn map, but given in terms he could not translate. Near river? She said. The cowboy nodded, which in his speech meant both understanding and an invitation to continue. They gave him answers. In fragments. We move, the second woman said, in a voice that made the words sharp as flint. We go. The third woman only looked at the window and then back at him, as if she wanted him to read the light on the glass. And he did. He had read camps, and tracks, and gestures before. Their economy of language did not obscure the gravity of their movement. They were not pilgrims, searching for pity. They were people, traveling with intent. The prairie, in its many moods, seemed to lower itself around the cabin, and listen. Wind came through the sill in thin fingers, and late afternoon sun found a way to gild the rim of a bowl left on the table. The cowboy sat and told them small, non-essential things about his time on the land, where the spring thaw left a patch of clover. How a fox had once tried to take a chicken and failed. How there was a place on a low hill where the wind always smelled of sage. These were the facts of a life, arranged without need for drama. The women accepted such things as one accepts weather. They asked no questions. He could not answer. Night took a lingering silence before it landed, and with it came stories that do not need names. The first woman sat by the fire and unrolled a strip of cloth from inside a coat. When she unfolded it, the cloth was plain but well kept. She began in English, then paused, choosing a word, and said, "Friend." She smoothed the fabric like a prayer. The cowboy took this to mean gratitude. He accepted it, and nodded, with a simple, Exchanges like that filled the room with meaning without claiming it. He learned their gestures as one learns a new trail through brush. The slight raise of a shoulder that meant watch. The way hands met in a compact knot that suggested kinship. They showed him a small practice by the hearth. After meals, one of them would gather the bowls and rinse them gently, pouring the water into the hearth to steam with the coals, and the motion returned the heat to the fire. He watched that with a curiosity that felt like a boy learning a small miracle. They were not showy in their living. They were precise and efficient, survivors of a landscape that had demanded such things. At one point, the first woman rose and moved to the window. She placed a palm against the glass and looked across the prairie, with a face that measured each blade of grass. The cowboy watched her there, the light making a halo at her shoulder. She turned toward him and offered another thin sentence. "Rain bring them," she said. The words were simple, and the idea was plain. The storm had been a signal. He felt in his chest a small tightening, a muscle that dwelt at the base of the throat when a man considered responsibility. That evening, they shared a modest ritual that had weighed because of how plain it was. He took from the back of a drawer an old pen and an empty sheet of paper. He had a habit of writing the day's weather, the oddities of his yard, the things he did not intend to send. It was a scrap of a ceremonial life, a way to keep order. The first woman watched him write, tilting her head as if the action itself were noteworthy. She bent forward and traced a finger along a line of ink, the motion a soft curiosity. She tapped the paper and said a word that meant something like story. He laughed quietly. It was more a release than amusement. They did not ask for money or land. Nothing of that sort was offered or expected. The gift that passed between them was a shared meal and the shelter of a roof. In the morning, the prairie was damp and cold, and the cowboy set about mending a tear in one of the blankets. The second woman stood beside him and held the fabric as he worked, her fingers steady on the thread he pulled. When he finished, she lifted the blanket like an offering and made a small nod that was very like a benediction. Days were not measured there by calendars, but by the rhythm of chores and the weather. On the third morning after the storm, light came thin through the clouds and crawled over the grass. The cowboy had grown used to the particulars of 3 more pairs of boots by his hearth. He rose early to fetch water, and to feed this small patch of garden that refused to die. He had a letter folded in his pocket he had once meant to send. He had grown to imagine leaving the letter with the women, as if sending your words into a world that would carry them somewhere new. He did not do it. Instead, he kept the paper where he could see it, a quiet sentinel to a life left in midst. That day, when he came back from the well with the yoke resting on his shoulders, and a thought arranged like a stone in his jaw, he noticed something different in the mud outside the gate, where stormwater had settled earlier. It had left patches of heavy clay that held impressions, like a pressed coin. There were tracks. Not many. A shallow set of heel marks went by the fence post, and then diverged into a series of prints that suggested more than a single track. The pattern of a boot with tread not his own, sharp in places and muddied in others. He angled his head and traced the line with a subtle motion practiced from years of watching horses come and go. Animals left a different script. Human boots carried intention. He did not speak of them at first. He cleaned the bucket and set it by the door, and then he poured a cup of coffee because some things demanded the ordinary to keep the mind steady. When he entered the small kitchen, the women were gathered at the table, hands folded or resting, like 3 stones, placed with intent. The first woman watched him with an expression that admitted nothing. The second's jaw worked in a near-invisible way. She kept her hands in sight. The third looked out the cracked window where the light found a stripe across the sill. He lowered himself into the chair, and set his cup down. The wood on the table was warm from where his palm had rested. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The silence in that span was a thing with corners. It could be folded and moved like a piece of cloth, and each of them learned to handle it without tearing. When the cowboy finally lifted his eyes, he spoke with the plainness he kept for weather and hoofprints. "There's tracks," he said. The first woman stood quickly, as if the word itself had given measure to a body. She moved to the door and put a hand again on the latch. Her fingers felt the iron like a tool. The cowman's sense of craft and the woman's warrior manner met in that small touch. She peered outside into the morning where the footprints paused at the gate and then ran toward the line of trees. The prairie held them like a fossil in clay, a memory unwilling to vanish. "We should go," the second woman said, this time with English that carried the weight of necessity. Her voice did not ask for permission. The third woman stood and began to gather a small bag of their things, not hurriedly, but with the focused calm of someone who takes only what is needed and leaves the rest as testament. He felt, for a moment, the old animal tug of possessiveness. The man who had built a house and kept a life for himself felt called to protect the place he had kept sacred, but the sensation he felt stronger than ownership was the part of him that recognized need. The 3 had been brought there by weather and, perhaps, by fate. The tracks outside were a sign that the same elements moved in human lives as in storms. Pursuit, passage, and sometimes mercy. In the form of shelter. He put his cup down and rose. His actions were steady and the sort that come from long practice. There were horses to be moved, doors to be secured, a horse to saddle in case a man had to show himself where he wanted to be seen. He did not show them fear, he showed them intent. The first woman looked at him then, her face stripped to a clarity that belonged to a leader. She spoke with an English shaped by necessity, and a cadence that felt like a map. "Our path." She gestured between the stand of trees, and a rough line where a trail sloped into shadow. "We go there." Her finger pointed to a place that said, without fanfare, "Safety." The cowboy assessed the prints again. They told no lies about size or intent, only the movement that had passed and where it had paused. Men on horseback, perhaps, or on foot with long legs. He could imagine them at the edge of the trees, looking back and watching for any sign of the persons who had walked that way. It was a simple, stark reading. These were tracks of pursuit, and the people at his table were the ones being followed. He could have fished for an easy answer, warn them and hide them, and let the prairie keep the rest. But his heart, the part of him that kept time by the cadence of a horse's hooves, and the burn of coffee at dawn, settled his resolve. There are small heroics in the world that are not sung about. The man who drags a log off the road, the person who stays up to watch over a sleeping child, the hand that steadies a stranger's blanket. He chose in that way, not for praise, but because it was the shape of him. "Stay inside," he said simply. "Lock the door, I'll be back." His voice did not carry the edge of a threat, but the flatness of a promise. The first woman nodded. The second woman took the blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders and folded it against her chest. The third woman paused and placed something small on the table. A scrap of cord, a feather perhaps. A plain thing that looked like a token, but might be only habit. They did not speak much because the language they had carried was sufficient. The Prairie heard their movements, and kept them as if it were a ledger with time to spare. He stepped out into the morning, and felt the cold bite of the air, like a forward. The land smelled of wet grass and old smoke. The prints in the mud were darker now that the sun had lifted an inch. He walked the line where they had passed, feeling the give of the soil. His boots made new impressions that overlapped old ones, like a conversation between past and present. When he reached the gate, he paused and looked at the low ridge, where the trees made a shadow, a place the women had indicated earlier as their path. There was no sudden confrontation. The men who had followed were not visible yet. They were a presence in the shape of tracks, and the suggestion of voices that might be heard among branches. He imagined them leaning on saddles, speaking low, their horses stamping water from their coats. He imagined motives that need not be named to be understood. Men hunting people for reasons that had to do with power, fear, and a callousness bred by want. He did not invent their faces. The Prairie had little use for faces. It kept movements in the ground. He turned back toward the cabin. The women were gathered at the table. The first watched him with a patience that startled him. She had a way of looking as if she were counting each second for value. The second woman stood with a bundle ready, and the third's hands were at rest on the plank top. They did not appear afraid. They were composed in the gravity only those who had learned to make room for themselves within chaos can be. He made a decision that felt both small and enormous. He would do what he could to give them time and space. He would make himself an object that could be seen and followed. A diversion. He would lead danger away, so that the women could move on. There was no eloquence to this plan, only the slow arithmetic of a man who had spent his life weighing risks. He would not lie to himself about the cost. The land had seen such choices made before. The Prairie kept each one like a pressed leaf. Before he left, he carved a short note, and set it on the table where the lantern's light would find it, and where hands used to handling bowls would see it. The paper was his careful hand. Simple, short, a thing of plain truth. He did not know if it would be enough, but he placed it where any passing eye could find it, where a returning hand could trace the ink. The action of writing and placing the note was like tying a rope around his own heart. It anchored the thought of being responsible, even when he stepped into the wind. The women watched him as he left. The first woman's eyes were steady as stone. She did not attempt to stop him. The second woman gave a tilt of the chin that could have been a blessing. The third woman, who had preserved her silence, made a small movement of her hand that was private and eloquent. She raised it slightly, and then let it fall. An unspoken benediction. When the cabin door closed behind him, the sound of it knocked at the edges of the morning like a punctuation. Out beyond the gate, the Prairie extended, a living map of low hills and swales, a place that remembered every step and kept the record of it. The sky, wide as a cup, was indifferent and vast. He walked away from the warmth of the hearth, into the cooler breath of the field, making his own path so that any pursuers might follow him instead of the ones he intended to protect. Each step he took was deliberate. Each noise he made would be a signal for those who were watching. As he walked, he thought of the things he could loose in the world. A diversion of movement. A man's body, willing to be seen, where others must not be. He imagined the pursuers would read the marks he made, and take him for the quarry. The land under his boots held his prints, then held the possibility that others would step where he had walked. He sensed the prairie working like a witness, noting each tread and keeping it. It was not mercy, and it was not judgment, it was record. He paused at a low rise and looked back. The cabin was a small square, its chimney faintly smoking. Through the open window he could see the glow of the hearth, and, sitting close to it, the three figures, small against the light. He raised his hand in a small, almost arrogant gesture, a way to say he would return, to say he had left them safely. The first woman returned the wave, in the pattern of someone acknowledging a contract. The cowboy walked on, making his trail. The expression of the land around him shifted with the hours. Tufted grass whispered his passage, a hawk circled without comment, and far away the line of trees marked the edge of a shelter both literal and symbolic. He moved with a purpose that was less about action than about the promise of being visible. He wanted them to have time, and time was the only currency he had enough of to spend. Behind him, the prairie kept the echoes of his retreat. Its memory was patient. It recorded the fact of his leaving in the soft print of his boot and the hollow he made in the way the grass bent. It also kept the faint proof of those women arriving under rain, their small, sure keys of passage stamped into the mud. The land had a way of holding these things that was not sentimental. It simply did what it was made to do. Keep. Because it could not forget. By noon, the sky had cleared, and a heat lay over the ground like a held breath. He had made himself visible enough, and yet he had not forced the confrontation. He crested a ridge, and saw, not far below, the shapes of men moving with the casual confidence of those who believe themselves at ease on another's land. They rode low in their saddles, voices like the bark of dogs, and their horses were slick with the damp of morning. There was the weight of numbers in their movement that told him this would not be easy to distract. They would follow a man who made a trail. They would take the bait if he made himself clear. He changed pace then, slowing, making awkward movements, leaving signs that suggested panic or confusion. His mind worked with the practical minutiae that a man uses to make a plan seem natural. A knocked-over brush, an abandoned bandana, the casual jingle of spurs that hinted at direction. The men below took the bait with the single-mindedness of predators. They called to each other and pointed. The prairie listened to their words and held them without comment. He hoped, in the small privacy of his chest, that this would be enough. He hoped that the cabin would stand steady, and that the lantern he had left burning low would not give their position away too brightly. He hoped that the women for whom he had made this decision would be brave enough, or lucky enough, or cunning enough to take the window of time. He was vying for them. He did not have illusions about martyrdom. He had only the concrete, quiet certainty of a man who was willing to be seen so others could step past him unnoticed. When he turned his face to the wind and saw the line of riders move in their direction, he felt the prairie shift beneath his boots like a memory acknowledging a new note. The land took down what happened to it, like a ledger, and his act would be another entry. He walked toward the men with the slow steadiness of someone who had chosen to be a thing in motion, a moving target with intention. Each step brought the sound of hooves closing in, the voices tightening like a noose. He kept his movements measured, his heart a steady drum under his ribs. Far behind him, the cabin sat small and warm against the horizon. In the window, a shape moved, like a slow breath. The prairie, patient and broad and old, held the memory of what had been done, and what would be done. It kept the prints in the mud, the flattened grass where people had rested, the faint smell of stew that would linger in the walls for days. It was a witness that did not judge but did not forget. The cowboy walked into the place where the men's path crossed his own and waited for them to notice. When they did, he showed himself. Simple and plain. The kind of man a prairie tells you by the way he stands. Their eyes found him like two stones thrown at a quiet pond. And the ripple began. He did not raise a voice. He smiled once, an unmistakable human gesture in the face of a hard thing, and let the weight of his presence answer for any words he had not thought to say. The first horseman spurred forward. A swagger that meant he expected the easy thing. The cowboy met him with nothing but the steady look of someone who believed in exactly what he had set out to do. As the men closed, sunlight glinted off a metal buckle, off the dark leather of a rein, and the field folded them into the story that would be remembered. Back at the cabin, unobserved by the men below, a small scrap of paper lay on the table beside a bowl cooling in the fire's waning heat. The first woman had unfurled the cloth she kept and smoothed it on her lap. The second woman held herself ready, a cup held like an offering. The third woman watched the window with an attention that split the air into sections. Outside, the prairie remained the patient keeper of what the world refused to lose. The story had not ended. It had only reached the point where a man's decision had lodged itself into the land, and would be carried forth. The prairie remembered the tracks that the trio had made on a wet night. It remembered the way rain had brought them to a door. It would keep all that, as it kept the shapes of days. Not with fever, but with fidelity. The rest was a matter of steps and luck, and the small courage that lives in the ordinary chest of certain men. He walked into the place where their paths crossed, and waited for the men to notice. The prairie around him held its breath like a thing that was used to watching. Wind moved in low sheets, tugging at grass, and carrying with it the smell of damp earth and distant smoke. He kept his shoulders loose, and his hands visible. Every step he took was meant to be read. They found him as the sun burned halfway to noon. At first they called, their voices dropping into the long country speech that made threats sound like small weather. When a man comes at you speaking like that, it is part boast and part measurement, the cowboy answered, with the slow, open calm he'd used to bring in wayward animals, or stray men. A nod of the head, a smile that did not pretend everything was easy. It is strange how softness can look like confidence. They rode up slow, as if to see whether he would turn and run. One of them spat near his boot, and laughed, in a gleet sound against the broad, honest music of the land. The cowboy did not bite. He let the men talk. There was no point in showing the shape of his worry too quickly. Panic tells a story worse than silence. He unbuttoned a coat none could have guessed was patched twice, and let the wind take the flaps. He moved as if he had been lost and now stumbled upon a place to be found. He made noises that could be read as confusion, or as fear, the kind that begged for reassurance. The lead rider jabbed a finger in his face, more for show than need. "Where'd they go?" he asked, voice flat. The cowboy looked up the line of trees, toward the ridge the women had named, and gave a motion with his chin that matched the gesture of a man pointing a place on an old map. It was as good a direction as any. Toward shadows, towards cover, toward the unknown that men with guns often hate. "Over there," the cowboy said. It was not a lie. The movement of his body pointed like an arrow. He walked away from the cabin in a manner that made his trail unmistakable. He made a little show of spurring his horse, and swearing at an invisible snag. He kicked at a dunt shoulder of the earth, so that it fell and made a small tumble of broken prairie grass. He stamped and shouted with a kind of theatrical clumsiness. Bait, fashioned by a man who had the small, sure knowledge of how to be seen. They took it. The men followed, cursing and loud, keen to be the ones who found what they hunted. Their horses answered with the impatient click of hooves on hard ground. The cowboy kept turning so they could see him, so they would be sure of what they had found. He wanted their eyes to be fixed firmly on his back. In the trees, far from human clamor, the prairie listened, and kept its record. Grass bent where he had walked. Small clods of earth marked the passage of his boots. It took no pleasure in being witness, nor did it look away. It simply kept. He led them a good half-mile, guiding them across a rise and down toward a dry draw where brush made the ground sound different. He made false trails, shaking off direction like a dog shakes water. He left behind scraps he'd taken off for show. A weather-worn scarf tied in a conspicuous knot on a low branch, a broken glove tossed near a wash, a mucked-up scuffle in the dust. The men, hungry for the clean story. A trail promised, took them as signs. They changed pace to match the tenor of pursuit, and their voices sharpened with triumph. He walked so that his breathing matched the rhythm of the horses behind him. He slowed when they close, quickened when they slowed, letting them be the predator and himself the impossible quarry. He wanted them to make assumptions. That they hunted petty thieves, or cattle rustlers. That he would be easy to corner. He wanted them to be sure. They rode hard into the low ridge, where tracks disappeared into brush and shadow. For a while their shouting kept him company like some ugly hymn. Then, around a bend, where scrub and willow pooled dark as ink, the men found evidence that they preferred. A drag of cloth, the bent branch of a bush, a hint of fresh bites from a fast-moving party. They renewed their calls, and the prairie took note. Anonymous and patient, the diversion worked as well as the cowboy had dared hope. The men fanned out in the brush and moved with the careless confidence of those who believed themselves safe under their own assumptions. They paid no mind to a small goal of crows' assemblage on a distant fence post, to the exactness of the sun on a tin roof far away. They were men in pursuit, and pursuit narrows the mind. He let them go deeper, leading them away with the steady step of a man pretending to be lost. Once out where the brush grew thick, and the sun tumbled down through leaves, the men halted and argued. Voices rose and fell. One of them, impatient, or perhaps cruel, fired a warning shot that cracked the air. It was a useless sound in an old country. It left no shape, but a halo of fear. The cowboy answered by lighting a stick of sage he had tucked in his coat, a small, practical fire to clear his head and mask his scent. And then he walked on, calm as a man making an errand. The chase thinned. The men divided into small parties. The lead rider swore and gestured and then fell silent, his face collapsing at the edges as the doubt set in. They had expected closure. They found confusion, and a land that recorded their effort without care. The prairie did not hide what had happened. It merely kept the prints in the soft places, and let the wind erase them slowly if it could. It was not in the habit of favoring one story over another. By mid-afternoon, the men had passed where the cabin stood, and were moving with graver caution. The cowboy had put enough space between them and the women, so that their trail would not be followed backwards. Toward the house, he watched them from a low hollow, their profiles small against the plain. One of the riders spat again and laughed, then nudged another, and they rode on with the slow, certain motion of those who think the world belongs to their steps. As they disappeared into the thin line of trees, the cowboy let out a sound he had been keeping like a thing in his chest, turned his face toward the long sweep of the prairie. Relief came like a heat, not a boom, but a bright expansion that made his bones feel less hollow. He walked on in the direction of the cabin, each step measured, as if returning from prayer. The land held his prints as always. They lay there alongside the marks the men's horses had cut, and the shallow, earlier prints of the women's hasty approach. When he crested the low rise, and saw the roof of the cabin, something old and heavy inside of him shifted and remembered warmth. He found the door as he had left it, latched, lantern low, blanket folded near the hearth. On the table lay the short note he'd written before leaving, the ink slightly smeared where the air had come through the chimney. But beside it now were other small things, not coins, not a list, but tokens chosen with care. A slip of paper had been tucked half under the bowl. The first woman had left her handwriting in a line as deliberate as all her movements. The third woman's silence had become a shaped presence in the way the paper was folded. Neat, economical, like a person who would never waste ink. His name was not on the paper. Names were not necessary, the note read in a few tidy strokes. Thank you. Safe. Be well. Beneath the words someone had placed a small, smooth stone, one that had been worn by water until it fit the curve of a palm as though made for the hand that would later hold it. It was a river stone, dark as the underside of a trout, warm to the touch from the day's thin sun. Folded beside it, there lay a strip of cloth, with a soft red pattern there at the edge, the kind of fabric that carried smell and history without announcing either. The cloth smelled faintly of smoke and a steady human use. The gifts were spare, full of meaning, without pomp. He sat down then, the old chair creaking under him like an animal settling. He held the stone and turned it in his hand. It was heavier than it looked. The texture of the place where river had smoothed its face caught his fingertip. He thought of water working and patient, of the slow ways the world shapes small things into their forms. He let the cloth unfurl across his knee. The pattern was simple, a row of diamonds and lines, and at the hem, a tiny stitch. Perhaps a repair done in the dim light of a camp, or on the move. The note, the stone, the cloth, each one pressed like a hinge into his chest. He placed the stone on the windowsill and the cloth across the back of a chair. Objects were not trophies to him. They became, instead, a new and quiet evidence that his life, so ordered by routine, had touched other lives and received touch in return. The Prairie kept a ledger of such things. It marked the small generosity between strangers. He read the note again, this time letting each word sit. The short sentences had been enough to hold the weight of gratitude without making it heavy. He traced the letters with a fingertip as if to make sure they had been there. Then he folded the paper and slid it into his pocket, a living thing to carry. Days after the men had gone, the world resumed its old rhythms. The prairie returned to the tasks it keeps like a clock. Wind measured how tall the grass would stand, and foxes resumed their secreted business. The cowboy did what he always did. He fed the horse. He mended what needed mending. He read the sky and guessed the weather. But something in his attention had been altered. His eyes lingered more often on the low line of trees, on the way the light fell across a particular fold of earth. He found himself arranging the small objects the women had left, in a way that made them part of a new order. He kept the stone on the sill. At night it would catch the lantern's glow and throw a small, steady gleam across the rough wood. The cloth he draped on the back of his chair, so that when he sat it would brush his sleeve, and remind him. The note he kept in the pocket of his jacket, close to the place where heat lives, and when he took the jacket, it warmed the paper, and seemed to make the words, live, again. Weeks passed. Time in that country is something measured by equipment and weather and small acts. The cowboy's life resumed its quiet pattern, but now small rituals threaded the days. He polished the stone sometimes with the back of his hand, not because it needed it but because the motion steadied him. He hummed when he worked now, at odd moments, an ungenerous little song that had not been there before. He wrote less in his empty ledger of daily weather but more in the quiet, making notes that were not meant for anyone but himself. He would scratch a line about the way the sky glowed at dusk and then pause, thinking of people who passed like birds across a long field. One raw morning, when the light was still coming up new and the air smelled of pressed frost, he found a small piece of cord tied to the gate. It had been placed there as carefully as if someone had meant him to notice. The cord was dark and slightly worn, and a feather, small and black, was looped through it. He took it and held it for a long moment. It felt like a message left where any returning eye could see it and understand. "We remember you," he answered, in his own way. He took a little scrap of leather and knotted it to the post, not as payment, but as reciprocal, marking the sort of small ceremonial that two people who barely spoke might exchange. The prairie took both markers without comment. Not long after that, toward dusk on a day when the light seemed to hold itself in long, soft gloves, a figure walked up the faint track, toward his cabin. The silhouette at first could have been a trick of the trees, a long shadow of a deer or a man on horseback, but as she came closer, the cowboy recognized the way she moved. It was the first woman returning, the one who had spoken English most, whose gait had been steady in storms. She walked alone, and the way she bore herself suggested no necessity to conceal. She came forward with the same resolve with which she had first spoken at his door. There was a kind of equal measure at work now between them. He met her at the threshold with the manners of a man who was both hospitable and cautious. She carried a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tucked under her arm. On her shoulder hung the light line of a strap that held simple tools. She had not dressed for a social call. Her hair was dusted with Prairie, and a faint salt of sweat. She looked like a woman who had kept to her intent, and did not ask for more of the world than she was willing to take. "You come," he said, the words fitting his mouth like a small opening in a wall. She gave a thin smile. "I come. I bring." Her English came slow and selected, as if each word was a carefully chosen stone. She stepped inside and set the bundle on the table. When she unwrapped it, the cowboy saw that there were two things. First, another smooth stone, almost like the one she had left before, but paler and thumb-worn. Second, a larger piece of fabric, patterned and sewn, the kind of cloth that had crossed hands in camps. She folded the cloth and handed it to him. The pattern was familiar and foreign at once. A repeated diamond along the edge, a subtle border that spoke of many small stitches done in dim light. The cloth smelled of river smoke, and a warmth that had nothing to do with any cooking fire. It smelled of a life kept on the move, and tended with care. He touched the fabric, and felt the fibers. It was thicker than the piece he had been given before, and its fold carried a weight like a promise. She did not stay long that evening. She sat by the fire, while he set a pot on the coals, and listened to him speak, as one might talk to the air. He told her things that were small and honest. About the well, about a fox that had taken to watching his chickens with the politeness of a neighbor. She smiled sometimes and, in return, showed him a small, private set of motions. How to fold a blanket to keep heat, how to tie laces in a way that would not loosen under stress, a quick knot to make a strap last. She showed him less of words, and more of making things hold. Before she left she said, in English that was all the more striking for its directness, "My heart saw the cowboy first." The sentence arrived simple, and nearly without flourish. It carried one of those rare plain truths that do not need elaboration. There was no romance in it, no demand. It was an observation, a fact, that had weight. The cowboy felt a small hollow at the bottom of his ribs. That weight he had carried was lighter because a person had placed a name upon the shape of it. She pressed into his palm the paler stone, and then, with a gesture precise and brief, tied the larger patterned cloth around his wrist as if binding him, in a way, to a new and gentler standard. He felt their textures like promises. He did not know that these small tokens would become anchors in a life that had been set to drift. He only knew that the prairie kept the memory now of more things. Of a night when 3 women had been sheltered, of a man who had walked to be seen and taken the risk, of tokens exchanged where neither party expected to own the other. Before she left, she stood at the door and looked across the sweep of the prairie. For a long moment, she did not speak. Her hand rested on the frame, and the quiet of the land entered her like a slow breath. She turned finally and said something else, short and deliberate. "If you come," she said, "we will show." "Show? What?" he asked, because old habit made him ask the sort of question that needed a particular map. Her mouth lifted. "How to be anchored," she replied, "how to keep a place and keep oneself." Her English there had a cadence that meant it was both an invitation and a test. It was, he understood, an opening, not to be taken lightly. He thought of the rails of his life, the ways he had arranged things, so he would fit the pattern he had chosen. He had a particular gravity to his solitude, and the idea of stepping beyond the prairie, into the world that had sheltered these women, was both alluring and terrifying. He said nothing at first because words would have rushed the small, careful interior change that had begun. When she stepped away into the dusk, the prairie received her like a ledger turned to a new entry. The wind ran its fingers across the grass, and seemed to note the direction of her steps. A crow lifted, and took the air. The cowboy closed the door slowly, and then, as the light loosened from the day, he sat at his table and took the stone from his palm and the cloth from his wrist. He placed both on the windowsill beside the other stone, and watched how their shadows leaned toward each other. In the weeks that followed, he found himself altered in a way that the land kept with quiet accuracy. He began leaving the lantern lit a bit later and taking his meals outside when weather allowed, so that he could watch the track of sunlight and the small movements of the plane. He added a careful notation to his ledger. Visits marked by tokens, and the dates of rain that had brought them. He made a small envelope of leather, and kept the women's note inside, along with a scrap from his penmanship that he had once meant to send to no one. The objects sorted themselves into a small shrine of ordinary things. He wrote a letter one morning, a thing that felt like twisting an old key. He had always written about the weather, about the day's chores. This one was different. He wrote it not to a name but to the place that had become an intermediary, to the other lives that had passed through his door. He told the women, in a few lines, that the hearth was his, and that he would keep it warm, that he had the stones and cloth, and that they had set his portion of solitude easier to bear. He did not seal it for a postman. Instead, he folded it into the same pocket he kept the first note, and left it on the sill where any returning hand might find it. Months stitched there, quiet together. The prairie changed with the seasons, and kept the memory of the summer rain and the winter thaw equally devoted. Treks came and went in the soft parts of the earth. Some faded in wind, and others were smoothed by snow. But the marks the women had left in his life were stubborn. He would find himself reaching for the small cloth before a day he deemed hard, wrapping it briefly over a sore place in his hand, and then tucking it back where it belonged. The stones rested like sentries, two dark dots on a pale sill. On one late autumn evening, the sky a thin pale that promised frost, a sound came across the wind. The faint jingle of a strap, the whisper of fabric. He opened the door and saw, not one, but many, a small group moving on the ridge. A settlement, small and careful, that suggested people had come together on their own terms, and made a place of their own. He recognized, near the front, the first woman, and behind her, a few strong figures. They did not come as visitors, but as neighbors. Their arrival was not loud. It fit the soft geometry of the land. They did not ask for permission to stand near his gate. They merely stood, the way people who have learned to carry themselves publicly do, a balance of independence and the readiness to share. The first woman stepped forward and placed one hand lightly on the gatepost. The cloth around her shoulders caught the faint light, and shimmered like a thing that had been tended. "Come," she said to him, and this time her voice carried an ease. "Stay. Visit. See what we make." Her English was a measured thing. Now, with the ease of someone who had practiced a phrase until it fit her mouth without stumbling, he looked out at the small settlement. It was not a town. It was a cluster of shelter and smoke that spoke of people who had chosen a way to be. Tents and crude frames, a stacked cook fire, a line of clothes drying in a wind that was already turning colder. There were faces there that were not unfamiliar. Faces that had been folded into his life as gestures and tokens. The sight of them made his chest move in a new rhythm. He did not decide in that moment, he said. Instead, "I will come." Nothing dramatic followed. It was an invitation that unfolded over time, not a narrative climax. He packed a small satchel days later, not with goods, but with resolve. He wrapped one of the stones in a scrap of cloth and put it in the bag. He took the longer letter he'd written, and folded it to fit within. He walked the small path to the settlement, with a gait that had grown comfortable with purpose. They received him, simply. The settlement did not make a spectacle. Someone handed him a cup of broth, that had the honest taste of a place where food was meant to keep someone warm, and not to impress. Conversations there moved in short bursts. Not a flood, but enough syllables to make him feel included. They showed him the ways they kept watch, the paths they used, so as not to tread on strangers' gardens, and the small rules they held, so that they might stay together without dominating each other. He learned things that had little to do with grand plans, and everything to do with living. He learned how they tied their loads for travel, which grasses made better bedding, how to listen to a horse, and know when it is tired. He taught them to mend a fence, and how to split wood to keep a steady burn. It was a barter of skills between people who had learned to value competence and dignity, above all. Over time, the visits became regular. He spent nights in the settlement sometimes, and returned to his cabin. Other times, the Prairie kept both locations in its long memory. It held the prints of his boots at the edge of the campfire, and also the faint swelling of the ground where the cabin's posts held. The land did not choose favorites, it kept. In the slow untangling of days, the cowboy allowed himself small changes. He began to write less about weather, and more about people. His ledger now had entries like, left stone by window, women visited, fire held. He drew small maps of trails in the small places where herbs grew. He took a letter once to the settlement, and left it by a post, where the women had gathered. He did not expect an answer, but one came in the form of another small token. A scrap of red thread looped through a nail on his gate, tied in a knot. He had seen them make around a bundle during a storm. The Prairie, patient as ever, continued to bear the records. It held the prints of feet, the tight circles where fires had been built, and the tiny places where kindness had happened. It held, too, the quiet evidence of human evolution, that two lives that had brushed might find, in the ordinary course of living, ways to touch more deeply. It was not a miraculous change, it was a slow reweaving. When winter came, it gave the land the stern but honest face of trials. Snow lay thin over the grass at first, then thicker, and the world became a palette of white and iron. He watched, one morning, as the Prairie took on a quality like memory, under frost. Each step left a clear print, each track, a little memorial, that would remain until weather reshaped it. He saw the women move across the snow toward his place, carrying soft parcels of dried meat, and jerky, that smelled like labor, and thought, and careful preservation. They offered these things with a kind of reciprocity that took his breath a little, not to repay him for shelter, no artifact of exchange, but to be part of the mutual life that had formed. "You taught me to not write," the second woman said once, as they stood near the woodpile. And they laughed, because the cowboy had broken his own rules, and borrowed her lesson. He had, in truth, taught them nothing he hadn't learned by living. The exchange was more like a reciprocated ritual, a passing of craft. On a night when stars were hard and the fire crackled like a steady heartbeat, the cowboy sat in his chair, and pulled from his pocket the original note the first woman had left. He read it again, and then set it on his knee. The words were few, but had the traction of truth, he thought, as men do in single rooms with the light trimming the edges of the world, of what it meant to be remembered. It was not a boast, it was not applause, it was a small miracle. Someone had seen him and, without a fanfare, had attached to him a place in their memory. He wrote another brief entry. It was not for the ledger, but for himself. He wrote that the Prairie had, in its unblinking way, taken note of the women's passage, and had kept it, as it keeps everything, simply, and without sentiment. He wrote that he, too, had been remembered now, not only by land, but by persons who could speak in the small language of tokens and visits. Seasons slid on. When spring returned, the Prairie gave up little things. A patch of clover, a thin bloom, the first vigorous blade of grass coming up and making the world look newly patched. The cowboy walked often now, sometimes to his cabin, sometimes to the settlement, his gait less solitary than before. He would pause at places where the ground showed the faint scars of last summer's tracks and feel, like a man reading a map, the record of what had happened. He would run a thumb along a stone, and know that water years ago had shaped it. He learned to read the language of small things in his older life and find in them the architecture of belonging. The prairie remembered her, and not in the way people expect memory to work, as if it were someone hoarding recollections for sentimental use. It remembered by keeping the marks, by letting prints remain long enough to be found, by letting cloth fray where it would, and paper yellow. It remembered her, because she had stepped upon it, because she had been sheltered there, because she had left pieces of herself that a man took home, and kept. He placed, in the end, the two stones together, on the sill, and folded the cloth across the back of his chair. The note, the first small line of gratitude, he kept folded in his wallet. On nights when wind ran long and the stars were a single sheet of white, he would look out over the stretch of land and think of the 3 women who had come in the storm and of his small, stubborn choice to open a door. He would imagine the women laughing in some dusk, not his own, or mending a blanket by a different hearth. These were acts of imagination that did not demand anything of them. There were many ways he conceived the shape of what had happened. There was a moment, late one evening, when the prairie and he'd reached a quiet accord. He stepped outside with the cloth in his hand and wrapped it tight around the stone like a small bundle. He walked across the soft hill behind the cabin until he came to a place where the ground sloped, and the stars could be seen as if a bowl had been tipped open. He sat there and set the bundle down, placing it on a rock that he pressed into the soil like a marker. He stood a while and then, with a simplicity that felt like a prayer, he dug a small hollow and nestled the stone there. He covered it with earth so that only a small face of rounded rock remained. He did not call it a monument. He called it, to himself, a remembering. The act was not for show. It was for the land, and for the memory that the land would keep. He made a small cross of twigs and placed it beside the rock, not as a claim but as a boundary marker. Here, he thought, is where we said something to one another. And the prairie kept it. Years that followed did not erase the memory the prairie held. Footprints deepened into the memory of the sod, and then softened. New marks overlapped, the cloth faded, and then was replaced. The stones stayed, though their edges grew softer. The settlement grew or moved as need demanded, and sometimes the women came, sometimes they did not. Life kept its practical business. Memories settled into the shape of daily life. The cowboy grew older by the small degrees that life allows. He still mended fences, and still kept stew bones for storms. He kept the hearth warm, and the kettle ready, but the quiet of his days had shifted. The prairie had altered the shape of his solitude by making sure his acts of kindness were not swallowed by the wind. They were recorded. They were not loudly lauded, but they were kept like seeds tucked into the soil. One night, under a sky so crowded with stars it felt as if the sky itself had stitched a net, he sat by his window and looked at the sill where the stones lay. He turned the cloth over and over in his hands, feeling the worn edges and the faint thread repair. The letter he had once written, he read again, and then, with hands steady from long use, he took the paper and placed it with the other small items. The prairie, in the last light, held everything it had seen that was human and small. The sheltering of 3 women in a storm, a man who left to draw danger away, tracks that a season would not forget, a return that carried a stone and a cloth, an invitation that expanded a life. The land remembered the women because they had moved through it, and had allowed it to hold them. It remembered the man's choice because his footsteps had insisted upon being read. There is a manner in which the earth keeps better faith than people often expect, in the quiet ledger of ground and weather and small marks. The prairie kept the story the way a book keeps a sentence. It did not make the story larger than it was, it simply preserved the details. The exact wetness of a footprint in clay, the particular tone of a stone's surface, the faint pattern on a cloth that had once been wrapped against rain. These things are not bright with glory. They are dull and true. When the cowboy finally walked out one late evening and passed the low rise to look over the land, he saw a faint line pressing across the grass where feet had once passed in a hurry. It was nearly erased, a whisper of a track, and he leaned down and felt the hollow with his hand. He touched the ground with the reverence of someone reading a ledger, careful so as not to blur what was written. He placed his palm flat and for a long while listened to the unspoken answer of the world. It seemed, in the way the prairie kept things, to say nothing extravagant. It said only what it had always said, that it had seen, that it held, that it would not forget. The cowboy pressed the small stone into the hollow at his feet, and covered it with soil. He let the patterned cloth fall around his shoulders, and felt the faint embrace of human making. He looked up at the sky, where stars already burned like patient witnesses, and he understood, without being told, that some things are kept not for boasting but for the quiet continuity of existence. At last, he spoke, a low sentence in a world that often keeps itself quiet. "You remember," he said, and his voice sounded like a man addressing a year of weather, or a field of tall grass. He did not expect a reply in words. The prairie answered in the only way it knew how. By keeping. Time would go on. People would come and leave. Some would mend the earth, some would scar it and move on. But in that small place, where a cabin sat, and a man had offered shelter, when the storm pressed close, the record would remain. Footprints would fade. Stones would be smoothed more. Cloth would fray and be repaired. The prairie, patient and vast and attentive, would carry the measure of it all. If anyone asked him in years to come why he had stood in the open and let men follow him, he would likely smile and say it was nothing grand. He might say it was because his hands were used to mending, and because the simplest accounts of kindness often begin with the willingness to be seen. He might say that the land keeps things better than human memory alone. He might, if he felt like being generous with a stranger, hand over the smooth, pale stone, and let a new set of fingers feel what river and time had done, and what one small exchange can do to a life. He kept the tokens close, and the note folded in his pocket, and when he lay in his bed and looked up at the night, he saw the stars as a map of the many small things the world does not lose. He thought of 3 women moving through rain and being sheltered by a door he had opened, of the men who had followed after, of the small diversion that had allowed them to slip away. He thought of the stones, the cloth, the short, steady sentences of gratitude. He thought of the long ledger that is the earth, and how it keeps the record with neither sentimentality nor neglect. The prairie remembered her when no one else did. Not as a boast, but as a truth of place. It held those steps and those gifts in its quiet way. It kept the fact of generosity, the evidence of risk taken for the sake of strangers, and the delicate exchange of dignity between people who might never otherwise meet. It stored these things in the way it stores all things, pressed into the ground, caught in the grain of wood, held in the scent of spring grass. In that keeping, the story endured. If you have come this far, know that there are moments like this, in any quiet country. Small, luminous acts that do not make the history books, but change the counties of people's hearts. Perhaps you have once, in your own life, given shelter to someone when no one else would. If so, remember, even if the world forgets, places keep. The land will remember the steps, the stones, the cloth left on a sill. The memory will be quiet, but it will be faithful. If this story touched you, please like and share, and consider subscribing for more tales that listen to the small, true things people leave behind. And before you go, ask yourself, who did you give shelter to when no one else did?